don't think that the juxtaposition between absolute music and program music is valid, because I think that what we hear as listeners, we create our own narrative quite often. And for instance, in Beethoven's symphonies, apart from the Sixth Symphony, all the other symphonies are absolute music. But what happens, of course, and that is the strength of these pieces, that's why they are the most frequently played symphonies, that's why they are most universally loved symphonies. The reason is that there's something in the music that allows the listener to create his own narrative. And Beethoven somehow conveys these ideas of struggle, misery, journey from darkness to light, victory, all these kind of things that that are universally understandable for people, humans, regardless what your cultural background is. You can understand the inner narrative, and also vice versa. If you listen to the Symphonie Fantastique without knowing the story, it still works because of the fact that the music is so evocative that you create your own narrative in your own mind. And of course, if you know the story, then it kind of guides your idea of what it means. But I think that the classical division between program music and absolute music is psychologically actually not true. And also, on the other hand, you can listen to opera not understanding what's going on, not understanding the words, not even knowing the story. And it might still be a very powerful emotional experience. So I think that music works in many ways that we don't know yet. And I think that there's a big, huge vacuum in a hole in the sort of research. We have musicology, okay? We know we can analyze a score, we can do a Schenker analysis, we can do like set theory analysis. We can analyze music in many very precise ways in terms of the structure. And we can analyze music as a sort of historical phenomenon. We can analyze music as a sociological phenomenon. We can analyze music as a physical phenomenon. We can measure the vibrations. We can measure the frequencies and all that. But what hasn't been studied enough is what actually happens when we perceive music. The interface from sound to our inner psychological process. And that, for me, is really interesting, because I would like to know why one piece of music is immortal, has an eternal life, and why another piece of music disappears. Why are there melodies that have been sung by generations for 1,000 years, like, some folk songs? And why that tune? Why not the next one? I mean, all these people made up these tunes, and one has this life and the other disappears. And I would really like to know, and what does Paul McCartney do that somebody else who wrote another song in '67 couldn't do? And why is Yesterday, why do everybody know it? And what is the process that happens when we hear music? We don't know very much about it. And I think that a big part of this is that when we hear music, it triggers a certain process in our minds that we create our own interpretation of it. And it may be, there's always some kind of synesthesia. And we might see colors, we might feel, we might kind of think of certain narratives, some kind of inner story. Mm-hmm. We might react physically, we might, the skin might go goose pimples.
Movement.
Yeah, and I think that what happens with music is that it opens up, it connects things, and I'm not sure whether there is such a thing as a pure musical experience. If you hear a Beethoven symphony, for instance, there is no such a thing as absolute music, because it's always a combination of several things, and I think that would be the most fascinating subject of research. And we have a science called psychoacoustics, which basically looks into the way how the brain perceives sound waves. But for me, the really important thing is what happens after that, when the brain has perceived the sound waves. And then there's this sort of translation of the sound waves into something that we actually feel emotionally. And that's the important place. Well, of course, there is a difference from the point of view of the intention of the composer. But so Berlioz was writing program music. That was his intention. Beethoven was writing absolute music. That was his intention. But the problem is that so much of musicology is based on analyzing the intention and not the reality. And most of the German music theory, for instance, is about what the composer was trying to do, and less about what he actually did. And in this case, I heard a story about a Swedish anthropologist, musicologist who went to Africa and studied a pygmy village, and he played some music for them. He played Beethoven's 7th Symphony, and he played some Schubert, and he played some ABBA, and some Elvis, I think. And people, after having heard all that, they said, well, can you play that? So he asked, which one did you like best? And they said, we like the one that made us feel like birds. And he said, well, which one was that? Beethoven, Beethoven's 7th Symphony. Made them feel like birds. And I thought, this is the most beautiful metaphor. So that there's music that is supposed to be absolute music, okay? But the reaction is that we feel like birds. But they all felt like birds. So there's something about music that makes things connect in a way that we don't know much about. And the difference between Berlioz and Beethoven is in the intention, but not so much in the actual reality. You can hear Symphonie Fantastique as a piece of absolute music, and you can hear Beethoven symphony as almost like an opera. And it's individual, and that we know little about that mechanism. I think that Berlioz was the first composer who, for whom the instrumental gesture, gesto strumentale, was very clearly defined. So what the clarinet does could not be done by any other instrument. And the physical gesture is part of the expression. Whereas even in Beethoven, in Schubert, it is the oboe, it is the horn, it is so on and so forth, but it's still like an abstract, it's an abstract musical idea that is then being written for an instrument. And it could be this or could be that. And like for Bach, he didn't specify the instruments very, very clearly ever. It was, could be, depending on what was available there, it could be this or that. And I think Berlioz is the first composer for whom the instrumental gesture is an essential part of the expression. And this is not the case with Beethoven. For Beethoven, instruments are things that convey his musical ideas. But for Berlioz, instruments are things that are his musical ideas. So that is a fundamental difference, I think. Yeah. Also, for the first time, space enters the world of symphonic music. So distance, space. And the other thing, which is interesting, is that we have to remember that the society where these people lived was much more quiet. There were no cars, there were no jet engines, nothing was amplified, obviously. So the basic level of sound in the world was very much lower. And I think the loudest man-made sound was the church bells. I would say around 1800. The loudest man-made sound was big church bells. And the loudest sound people heard ever was the thunderstorm. And if you think of the sheer volume of the end of Symphonie Fantastique, for instance, or with the church bells and the brass and the cornets and the trumpets and big brass section and all that, most likely people who were in the theatre to hear the first performance of Symphonie Fantastique heard the loudest noise they had ever heard in their lives. And this is an interesting idea, because now, of course, you go to a classical concert, you never think of that as a potential shock in terms of the loudness, because, if you go to a heavy rock concert, it's louder. But then, it must have been a really shocking experience, and I think it's easy to forget that. And still, Western orchestral music has the widest dynamic scale of all musics known to man. I mean, the scale is much wider than in pop music and rock music, of course, but also any folk music we know has a very limited dynamic scale. But what we do in Berlioz and in Mahler, Richard Strauss and so on, the scale is from minus 80 dB to 120, and no other form of music has this. And Berlioz was the first one to explode the limits of this. So I think this is an interesting thing to